Well, good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's afternoon for me. It's afternoon for you, Josh, out on the
Just
West
it
Coast.
just turned afternoon. Yeah, I'm at
Just
12:30
turned
right
afternoon. Okay, yeah. Here we're well into the afternoon. Our work day is almost
now.
over, my friend. So are we catching you right in the middle of your lunch break, Josh? Is that what's happening right now?
You are catching me when I would normally eat. I'm just going to
Yeah.
starve through this next hour, and I think we'll be fine. So I'm not worried about it.
So you're fasting. You took this so seriously. You're fasting through our webinar today.
No
That's
one takes it more seriously than I do, Louis. I'm really excited,
I
man.
love it. Good to see you. Good to see you. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Louis. I'm with Irresistible Church Network, and this is my friend Josh Crain. He's joining us today as my special guest. Josh is the lead pastor of Verve City Church out in Chino, California. It's Chino, not Chino Hills, right? Are those two different things or the same thing?
They're right next to each other. We're located in Chino. We have people who come from Chino and Chino Hills. We're right outside of Los Angeles.
Very cool. Very cool. So Josh is the lead pastor of Verve City Church, one of our partner churches of Irresistible Church Network, and a great thinker. Also really fun. No, yeah, great thinker. We've been to some deep philosophical conversations before, but also movie buff. Most important, this man is a
Most
movie
important.
buff and could take any of you guys down in some movie trivia. But anyway, that's just a little bit about Josh. Just to kind of bring you guys up to speed, what we're doing here on this webinar and what's going on is that we are in the middle of a series of webinars. Actually, I think this is number 4 in this series we've been doing every month. And this series of webinars is a series called A Church Every Community Needs. And it's after a book that is coming out this summer called A Church Every Community Needs. And what we've done is we have asked different lead pastors from around Irresistible Church Network to write a different chapter describing some kind of attribute of a church that every community needs. And so that's what we're doing this series on. So we've gone through multiple topics. Today's topic is after the chapter that Josh wrote, and this topic is a church that never gives up influence unnecessarily.
Mhm.
So that's one of the attributes of a church that every community needs. So we're going to be unpacking that a little bit today. But if this is one of your first times ever interacting anything that we've done with ICN, just know that our heart is to create a network of churches all around the world that are designed to attract and engage unchurched people, to remove all the unnecessary obstacles so that we can inspire people to follow Jesus. And as we do that, we just love meeting more and more church leaders and helping you guys go further, faster as you lead your churches, especially when it comes to designing your churches to engage unchurched people. And so we all know that that's a very big task, and there are a million things that go into it. And today we're just going to tackle one little sliver of that, is this idea of managing or stewarding the influence we have as leaders and we have as churches. So, Josh, what do you say? Well, let's have a little back and forth conversation,
Yeah,
and
let's
then
chat, man.
and guys, while Josh and I are having a conversation to kind of set this up, you guys make sure that you know that we're going to have a Q&A with Josh at the end of this. So go ahead and all throughout our conversation, go ahead and start putting questions that you have for Josh in the chat. And just make sure you change your chat setting to everyone so that everyone can see your questions. So change your chat setting to everyone, put your questions in the chat. My team will get those questions to me. I'll get them to Josh, and we'll make sure that you get your questions to Josh at the end of this. But until then, Josh and I are gonna have a little conversation around this topic. So, Josh, first of all, when I first heard this, you just read the title of this, and so many questions come to mind. You know, a
Right,
church
sure.
never gives up influence unnecessarily. So tell us a little bit about some of the inspiration for this chapter. Mainly when I was reading through your chapter, you kind of talked about the social and political climate that was brewing that kind of led you to this idea and led you to want to help other church leaders by understanding some important things about stewarding influence. So why don't you unpack that for a second?
Yeah, I just started to think through how it is that the church has given up influence a lot over the last, say, 20 years or so. And as I was thinking through kind of like, for me, top level reasons, a huge part of it was the churches, and this is, I'm broadly speaking, I'm going to overgeneralize here, but the evangelical church has become very associated with a particular type of politic here in the United States. And a lot of times, if you see pastors on the news or kind of making news, it's because they are they're endorsing a political candidate, or they're telling people that, this is the most important election in American history and you have to get out and vote, or they're telling you to vote like Jesus would. And so I wanted to tackle that, because I think that a good argument's been made. A number of sociologists would say that the moral majority hit in about 1980. And that starting in the 1990s, we started to see a pretty massive move away from church. And so church participation held at about 70% for most of the 20th century. And now we're down, we dipped below 50% just a couple of years ago. That 20% difference is really, seems to have started about the time that the church got into the evangelical church got into heavily endorsing politics and politicians. So I just wanted to explore that a little bit, and some of the pitfalls of that, and some of the challenge of even that whole mindset. And then also, I think another huge reason has been just like character issues. We have people who have been elevated to a particular place, but then they have a moral failure, and it's often very public. And a lot of times churches, in an effort, I think, to try and protect the institution, they've covered it up or haven't been fully transparent about it. And it's only exacerbated things, made things worse. So those were a couple. We looked at more in the chapter, obviously, but those are big top of mind issues for me that I just felt like we're just giving away influence unnecessarily in those ways,
Okay. And so in just a second, we'll dive deep into both of those things, politics and even hypocrisy, moral issues, things like that in the church, church leadership. Before we do that, let's kind of define who cares? This influence that we're talking about, who are we trying to influence, and what are we trying to influence them, and why is it so important that we don't lose that influence?
Right. It's important for the church to understand what its primary mission is. And I think that the church's primary mission is to help people find life by following Jesus. And so we're discipling those who are within the church who've already made the decision to follow after Jesus. We need to keep doing that. But there's a whole load of people outside of the church who might find Christianity interesting or compelling or persuasive if they were to be able to give it like a really fair shake. And I think the reason we steward our influence then is to use it in order to point people to Jesus. It's not just to store influence up for the sake of it, but we want to actually have enough to where when we speak about Jesus, people are willing to give us a fair hearing of what it is that we have to say.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So that's a good just framework or lens to think through as we're thinking about influence among church and church leaders, and why that's so important. Okay. So in this chapter of your book, as you're unpacking this, you talk about 3 different principles that we need to keep in mind as we're stewarding influence that we have, and you talk about 3 practices or like how-tos or action steps maybe for church leaders. We may not get to all of those today, but let's just talk about some of those. The principle number 1 that you list in the book, you kind of alluded to this a little bit in your intro, but the principle number 1 you talked about is that the church should transcend politics. And I feel like that word transcend is so key and pivotal and intriguing, because I mean, I could think of lots of other words to put in there. Like, the church should fight for godly politics. The church should be involved in the politics of their local community. Like there are other words that seem like they would more naturally fit in there. So why do you choose transcend? The church should transcend politics, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think that the church, I use the word transcend because it also includes, it doesn't mean that you're leaving politics behind. It means that the way you're thinking about the world is that you could include a political component to the world and to your action and that kind of thing. But it gets us beyond getting caught up in the like right versus left, Democrats versus Republican, right? Obviously, I'm speaking primarily to an American audience when I'm talking like that. But we have so many things in our culture have been made political over the last 10, 20 years. And so many things people are trying to assign, well, is that a progressive idea or a conservative idea? Is that a Democratic idea or a Republican idea? And I think Christians have to break out of that mindset, because when your allegiance is primarily to the kingdom of God and not any particular version of the kingdom of this world, whether that's American or Canadian or Scottish, like then you can start to see beyond the categories that your culture is going to think in. So you can include them, you get it, you understand, and you can see that there are ways to be politically engaged that might be helpful to your culture, but you're going to transcend the normal ways of thinking about those as a church.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. So, but with that in mind, though, what would you say to the church leader who's also wrestling with this other side of the tension, where they may see like, well, when I'm reading scripture, I see especially like prophets to in the Old Testament to Israel calling the nation, back to God and being bold and taking a stand for for things and feel like, isn't that part of my role as a pastor or a preacher that's in the pulpit or on a platform? How do you balance those things?
Yeah, I think there's a theological error that a lot of people, I don't even know that they make it as much as it gets handed to them early on. We oftentimes kind of conflate what was true of Israel and assume that it must be true of America specifically. This is a very American problem, by the way. We think very highly of our country, but if you think that America has like a special eschatological place in God's kingdom, then you'll start to think that what was true of Israel should be true of us. So God calls Israel out as a nation, right, that ends up becoming the cocoon that births Jesus. I mean, they have a very important place in the story of Scripture, obviously, and in the covenant that God has with them. But that means when God sends prophets to them to talk about their failures, he's talking to them as people who have already decided to live a particular way. Like they've been called into a covenant relationship with Yahweh. And so when he's saying like you're failing to meet the covenant is essentially the message, like you're faltering over and over again to hold your end of the bargain. And so he sends judgment, and they go into exile. But that was the prophetic message. The last true Israelite prophet is John the Baptist. John the Baptist comes at the beginning of the New Testament, and he's making the way for Jesus. And he's really speaking to Israelites. He's speaking to the nation of Israel at that point. And they're at that point, obviously, under Roman occupation. But that is an old covenant way of thinking about things. So I think that what we see in the New Testament is a move toward Christians have particular moral values that they find in the teachings of Jesus and ways of living that they should uphold. But we should never assume that the general populace around us should share those moral values necessarily. And so while it's good for us to talk about why it is that we see the world the way it is, believing that we have a prophetic voice to call Americans back to Jesus who were never following Jesus and never in covenant with God in the first place, I think is really imposing an Old Testament paradigm in a New Testament reality.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So what would you say to the lead church leaders on here, the lead pastors that read your chapter, and they feel this tug from either friends of theirs, family, prestigious donors in their church, people that were maybe even at their church before they got there, and they are being pulled to take a side or say something, or they're saying too much, or they're quiet down, whatever it is. How would you speak to them and encourage them in a pastor way?
Yeah, well, the issue with the evangelical church in the United States is not that it chose right-leaning politics when it should have chosen left-leaning politics. The issue is that it chose to align itself so closely with any political party that it's hard to get even a crowbar of separation between them. So, most of you probably will have people in your church who vote one way or the other. And depending on which part of the country you are, that could be like a 50-50 split, or you may have 80% Republicans or 80% Democrats. Whenever you take a political side, when you choose like a party to align yourself with, or to tell people that they have to, they're biblically obligated to vote for, you've basically told about half of the American population that you have to believe this, buy this, or vote this way in order to come to Jesus. And so I just think that ends up conflating two very different issues. And so for people who are getting pressured to take a side, or a lot of times the way that I've heard it said to me is like, you need to take a stand, right? Like there's obviously a right way. I just want to encourage you to resist that, which means you will probably lose some people. If people are just looking for Sunday morning to be a continuation of Fox News or MSNBC, then they probably won't stick around if you refuse to go there. They may go somewhere else. But again, in allowing those people to leave and choosing who you lose, you'll have opened up the possibility that you can be an inviting and welcoming church that has space for all kinds of people around this particular issue. So I would just resist, even though there may be a cost to that.
So when it comes to this specific piece we're talking about now around politics, it's almost like you losing influence with some people is inevitable.
Yeah.
It's being strategic around how and the group of people that you're maintaining influence and stewarding that influence with. Is that what you're talking about? Like you're thinking?
Yeah, man. I think your church gets to be, I think every church, basically, we do a lot of things. I think we get to be known for like one thing. Yeah. So I want the one thing to be, being a church for that unchurched people love to engage with. I just think that's incredibly important. And most ICN churches would have some version of that as a vision that they're pursuing. And if you're going to make it about politics instead, then you're not going to be able to accomplish that more important thing. And so that's why I would just encourage, like, don't fall into that temptation to do that. I will say it's obvious that if you look at what churches grew post-pandemic over 2020, there are a lot of churches in the country that used to be smaller churches that grew by hundreds or sometimes thousands of people, catering to a very specific political ideology. And churches that went left actually tended to shrink or close down. Churches that went right grew and got more money. So there is like a human pull, an institutional pull, if you will, to cater to that group. I get it. But I think in doing so, you may attract more Christians who are already following Jesus from other churches and have a more conservative mindset around politics. But you will unfortunately put unnecessary barriers between your church and people in your community who don't know Jesus yet.
Gotcha. And one of the reasons why that can be, or to be careful around that, is one of the things you talked about in your book is this whole idea that parties and politicians come in packages.
That's
meaning,
right.
if you publicly align with one thing, you get everything. So what is that? What that means is like there's lots of other things that person or that party is known for, or they believe in, and might not align with what.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So my wife and I went, we had to go get a new car last year. One of us totaled the other one. Doesn't matter which one of us did that, but we're okay. And everybody's okay. So we had to go get a new vehicle, and we wanted leather seats, but we didn't want a sunroof in the vehicle that we were looking at. But their cars come in packages. And if you get the leather seats, you also have to get the sunroof, and you have to get, some kind of like seat heaters and all kinds of stuff. So there's different packages, and you may or may not want everything that comes with a package, but if you want this feature, you have to get the whole package. Political parties are like that. So you may, people weigh different issues of varying importance in the way that they vote. So if you're a 1 or 2 issue voter, it could be that you say, the most important thing to me is how the candidate votes on abortion, or the most important thing to me is how the candidate votes on, racial issues. Like, so you may say that's most important to you, and therefore I align with this candidate. But that candidate comes with a whole package of things. And sociologists and psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, has shown that a lot of times what we do is we pick a team, Democrat or Republican, and then we usually pick them for 1 or 2 major reasons. But then over time, our belief on all the other political issues starts to align with the side that we picked, because we're usually like consuming news, information, opinion pieces from the people who chose the same team that we did. And so what you can do is, instead of saying like, oh, I believe because of the Christian values I have, I'm going to vote this way. You kind of start there maybe. But over time, you start to become almost like a defense attorney for everything that party does, because now you're part of the tribe. You're part of the team. Yep. And so even, I really cared about their values on abortion, but now I also totally agree with their kingdom view of progressive income tax rates. Like, it's, and who's right about that? But you just start to align slowly over time. So you pick a team, it comes with a package. Some of those values align with Jesus, and some of them don't. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but neither Republicans or Democrats fully align with the kingdom of God.
What?
I know it's shocking. People are always surprised to find out. But when you start to realize that, you kind of start to get, I think, it's that transcending thing. You start to transcend the discourse in US, and you start to realize like, oh man, so I can pick whichever option I think is maybe the better of the two, but I should never become so entrenched in that no matter what, my candidate does or what that party stands for, I just rubber stamp it, because many times Jesus is going to push back on that stuff.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So politics is obviously one area where churches give up influence unnecessarily. And so your principle is that the church should transcend politics. Another principle that you mentioned in the book, another area different from politics, is principle number 2 is that pastors should embody what they preach, which this sounds obviously, but why is that so important right now? What have you seen ways that churches have just given up influence or lost influence unnecessarily because pastors did not embody what they preach?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen this. Obviously, I'm not going to name names today, but you've even in the last couple of months, a couple of pretty high profile pastors and worship leaders have had a moral failure that's made national news. And I was actually a few months ago was talking to a therapist who counsels pastors. It's part of what he does, and he shared with me he feels like part of the crisis in ministry in the United States is that a lot of times pastors get into ministry at a very young age. So you're 21, 22 years old, and you're a youth pastor. And no offense to 21 and 22-year-olds, but this therapist is basically saying, like, no one's actually ready to pastor people at 21 or 22 years old. Like, you don't have the life experience for it. You haven't faced the kind of storms you'll face
Don't
later
even have
on.
a frontal lobe.
Yeah, it's true. It's not even fully developed. So he was just saying, like, so what you have to do at that age is basically fake it to some degree, and you're kind of learning on the fly on a need-to-know basis. And because of that, he says he thinks a lot of people, as they get into their late 20s and early 30s, they have like a history of faking being spiritually mature enough or faking being, biblically based enough to kind of pastor people. And they just continue kind of faking it into their 30s and 40s and beyond. And so there's never like a solid foundation to build on. And then a lot of times when they get, because all of us do, right? We face stressful situations, whether that be in the church that we're pastoring or in our family. And then it's because there's not a great moral foundation there that's really created as a disciple of Jesus. There's a fall. And a lot of times, those who are most successful in ministry, oftentimes they have a lot of gifting. And Tim Keller's been helpful for me in this. He wrote an article a few years ago where he talked about the fact that if you're gifted, to teach or to preach or to instruct people, you can start to confuse the gifting with your character. And you can start to think that the gifts that you share with others are actually like synonymous with your own discipleship. But in fact, because your discipleship's not growing, God can still use you, can still use the gifts. But if you're not trying to, day after day, really submit yourself to the Lord, you can get older and stressed out and then have a huge flame out. And everyone will be surprised, you included. Everyone will be surprised because there wasn't that foundation to build on. So I think it's, part of making sure that we are practicing what we're preaching is really to take inventory of where we are. And if you're feeling burned out, if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling resentful of the job, like these are some early indicators, like how's your devotional life? Are you reading scripture beyond just what you're doing for sermon preparation? Are you in prayer on a regular basis? I mean, these are just great questions to ask yourself to kind of check your own discipleship pulse.
Yeah. So it's like taking an inventory of your heart, of your spiritual life, soul care. What have you found and tried over time personally that you feel like has been helpful for you in that inventory kind of area of spiritual leadership and making sure all the gauges are healthy and things like that?
Yeah. Right now, before in December of every year, I take a day away and I make a spiritual growth plan for my next year.
Okay.
So it's books that I plan on reading. It's always has a scriptural component. So some years I'm going to really focus on, this one book, and I'm going to read through this book of the Bible and also a bunch of commentaries on it and really just kind of soak in a little bit of information. I'm not going to try to read the whole Bible through. I'm going to marinate on a book. Sometimes it's like this year I'm reading the Bible through in a translation I've never read it through before. But whatever it is, so there's a biblical component, there's some books, there's usually a prayer component, like spiritual disciplines, essentially. Like, what are the spiritual disciplines I'm going to prioritize going to the next year?
Right.
And then every quarter, I also have a look back every quarter of the year to see, like, did I do what I said I was going to? If I didn't, like, what can I do in this next quarter to make sure that I'm realigned? So I'm just checking the gauges, and I actually schedule it usually before the year starts so that those are already built in the calendar, and I know it's coming up, and it just keeps it on my mind the whole time. When I first started trying to do something like this a number of years ago, I didn't have that quarterly kind of checkup. So a lot of times I get to the end of the year and I'd be like, oh, crud, I didn't do hardly anything that I was going to. The quarterly checkup's really helpful for me. And then I usually have a couple of friends close. Some of them are pastors, some of them aren't, just people I've known for a long time, who we'll check in with each other as well on how we're doing with our spiritual development. And my wife and I check in with each other a lot too.
Perfect. Good. Thank you. Helpful, practical stuff there. One of the things you mentioned in the chapter that I felt like was really good in this area was talking about preaching specifically and how a lot of times pastors will skip the heart part or the internalization of it. They'll prepare, they'll preach, and the message goes to their people. They'll prepare a message, preach a message, go to the people, but they skip the prepare and that hard part. Talk a little about that. And is there something practical you do to make sure that heart piece happens in your sermon preparation and planning? Like what does that look like? I understand the concept, but how do you make sure you miss out on the heart part?
I think, man, the challenge, and those of you who teach a lot, you know this, like you have a great Sunday that you prepared for and you're excited about it, and then it's over, and then the next one is coming. It's like I think of Newman on the old Seinfeld show. He just talk about how the reason postal workers go postal is because there's always more mail. It doesn't matter how much you deliver. And sermons feel like that. Like, man, okay, that was great. Got to do that again in a week, right? So if you're only preparing like week to week, I just don't think that it has enough time to kind of get in and settle in you. And so what I've tried to do, so there's the ongoing spiritual disciplines that we talked about just now, but then there's also I try to plan at least a year out on series. It's not the exact sermon, but at least a series coming up, so that even a year out, I can be reading things about that, thinking about things, looking through commentaries, and just kind of like marinating in some of what I will be teaching months from now. And then if I catch an article online, or if I hear a message from somebody else, like I'll just keep little notes of it in a software that I use called Craft. Evernote works though, or Obsidian, or any number of these kind of database softwares. And that way, when the time comes to actually preach it, I've been sitting with it for months. And so it's something that has not only I've not only thought about it, but I've also like tried to live it out, or act on it in a way that it's not just information. It's something that's already started to transform me. Therefore, when I talk to other people about it, I'm not just pitching a concept that I just read in a book the night before, that because I needed material, but it's something that is actually filled me up already.
So your I guess technique in this is time. That there's enough time.
There's no substitute for that, for time.
Yeah. Because you're not only time for it to marinate and internalize, but you actually have time to actually test out applying it before you ever even give the message.
Right. And in fact, I will say, like, the downside of this, just from a sermon prep perspective, is that usually by the time a series gets here, I've amassed so much material and so many thoughts on it that trying to cut that down to 40-minute messages is feels like death to me. So that's but I would much rather have to whittle something down than get up and be like, oh man, I have 35 minutes to talk and nothing to say. Like that's way worse.
Gotcha. Unfortunately, this isn't a webinar on sermon preparation. So guys, we would have to do a whole other segment about how to organize sermon preparation into a place where you have enough time to do that. But we do have some coaching available and other resources around sermons if you need to check that out. But
good. Love the plug.
Josh. Yeah, that's very good. Hey guys, like I said, in just a minute, toward the end of this interview, we're going to have time for Q&A for you to ask questions of Josh. So make sure you're putting those questions in the chat. Set your chat setting to everyone so that we all see the question. Put it in the chat. Our team will gather those. We'll get those to Josh in a minute. All right, Josh. So this whole idea of influence and losing influence unnecessarily is that, to summarize what you've said so far, is we want to be good stewards of the influence that we have as churches and church leaders, so that we can influence people who are far from God and inspire them to follow Jesus. And sometimes you've seen churches give up that potential influence unnecessarily by taking sides politically, or by not maintaining spiritual health. And then there is some kind of moral downfall or failure. And then that obviously loses influence. So politically, hypocrisy, those two kinds of things can cause us to lose influence with people we're trying to reach. But if I'm somebody listening today, watching today, I'm like, hey, there's got to be a time where a good reason to lose influence. I just have to make the decision. I know it's going to cost me some influence. And you kind of addressed this in your chapter as well. You said principle number 3 is that sometimes giving up influence is necessary. That's okay. Right. So we want to hear those. What is it? When is it? If it's not taking sides politically, if it's obviously not having a moral failure, when is it necessary to give up influence?
Yeah. I mean, there could be lots of times that it is, right? Because again, the reason to store up influence in the first place is to use it sometimes. And so influence, it might be necessary to give up influence by not choosing a side politically, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier, but sometimes in your refusal to choose a side. You'll actually give up influence with a group of people who really want you to. But if your mind is on like the ultimate goal is reaching more people with the gospel as opposed to winning a political war, then you may choose to give it up with those who would really like to see you use it for politics. So there's that. A lot of times you'll give up influence when you need to introduce change into your church. If you've been in ministry for a while, you've probably had the experience where there's a program that your church did for a while and it was really fruitful for a season. It was the 80s, but it was fruitful in the 80s. And so that means there are some people in your church now who they received the gift of that fruit that it bore in the 80s. And so they're like, man, we love this thing. We love this program. We love, whatever it is, evangelism explosion, whatever it is.
Yeah.
This was really impactful for us. But maybe over the last 5 or 10 or 30 years, it actually hasn't been that fruitful anymore. And so you think like, well, okay, we really need to pivot. Culture has changed. Time has changed, right? And so we need to do something more effective in this area. Because it was once fruitful, you'll have fans of it that will just be very upset with you if you choose to change it. But sometimes you know it has to be changed. And so that could go for any number of things. But anytime you introduce change into a church, whether it's with worship or program or even the way you preach, right? Some of us have changed the way we've preached in the last 5-10 years to be more effective for the culture. There will be people who just don't like change. We resist it. I have seen churches time and time again choose to die as a church rather than change.
Yeah.
So sometimes you got to say, look, the best thing for the most people, the thing that would be most beneficial for more people to connect with Jesus is to do this change. But you know that if you do it, there's a group of people who you're going to lose influence with. They may leave the church. They may stay and start an email campaign. They may stay but stop giving or stop serving. People have all kinds of passive aggressive ways to let you know that they don't like something. But if you and your leadership team, if you collectively like, we have to do this, it is worth losing influence to make a change in the church that's going to do a better job of reaching and discipling people. So that's another example of when it's absolutely worth it, I think.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. I know the 80s illustration there. Sometimes that's easy because you're thinking, well, that was a generation that was created by a generation before us, or that was even implemented by a leader before I got here. It probably gets harder when it's like, no, this is something that I instituted 10 or 15 years ago, or the
That's
people
right.
that
Yeah.
started this in the 2000s. They're still key people in our church, and it's time to shift. That's probably even tougher when you're having to look those people in the eye.
It can be. You're the best person to kill something you started, right? Because you carry kind of the like, oh yeah, but we needed this and it bore good fruit. I'm so glad we did it. But now it's time to move to the next thing. Sometimes if you're killing the thing that your predecessor started, then they'll see it as an implicit critique of your predecessor, right? And they'll feel really stabby about it. So the best thing, I think one of the best things you can do when you see a necessary change like that is to talk up how great this was, what a wonderful idea that your predecessor introduced it, the fruit that it's born, and then to just, give people that need and that hunger that, okay, but over the last few years, we've had diminishing returns because culture has changed. And so it's time to move to a new thing because we want to be as effective with what we do now as our predecessor was, 20 years ago. Like just anything you can do to not put people in a defensive posture and to gain them as allies for the change as opposed to opposition to the change is great. Again, you won't win that with everybody, but anything you can do to work in that direction is helpful.
Exactly. Okay, perfect. Okay, so there are a couple of, I'm sure there are more, but the two examples you gave times when. So this isn't about being so scared of ever losing influence for any reason.
No.
This is like sometimes it's necessary, and by not taking that side that a certain group wants you to take, sometimes you're going to have to lose influence with them, and that might be a necessary time. Another time might be killing that program that is not as fruitful or work. It may have worked with one generation, it's not working with this next generation.
Right, yeah.
And that may be a time, and there's going to be people that are going to be mad about it, and you lose influence with them, but sometimes that is necessary. Okay, gotcha. So those are the three principles you talked about. Before we jump into the three practices or how-tos or action steps, I want to remind everybody we are going to have a Q&A with Josh in a minute. Go ahead and throw your questions in the chat, and we'll get those to him in just a minute. So principles are great because they help us understand things, but sometimes there's not so here's what you need to do. So you give us 3 practices in the chapter, and one practice kind of goes back, or I would say the first 2 practices go back to the political side of things that we're talking about. And this practice number 1 is to train your church and staff to steward their influence. Like you have to, this isn't something that's just natural. Like you don't just hire people and they all already know how to do this.
No.
You're saying this is something you have to be very intentional
Yes.
about teaching, training, I'm sure repeating.
That's right.
Like that sounds daunting to me. I'm not a lead pastor, but how do you do that? How do you train? It's like every staff meeting, say, all right, guys, here's our segment on stewarding or influence. Like how do you do this?
I think if you're a lead pastor or if you're in like on your leadership team, one of the things that you need to do is you need to be consistently training your staff on how you think. They need to be able to understand, if they can kind of get in your mind and understand why you're doing what you're doing, they can kind of copy paste that philosophy or that understanding to lots of things you might do. So I'm not advocating for like a 2 days away and download everything you know into them. They will hate that. You will hate that. But I do think you drip it. You drip it in all the time. So for instance, we have talked to our staff about the 3 major psychographic profiles that are present in our church. There are more than that, but we have, I don't have time to get into all the details.
I've seen you do this breakout before, and this one was like 6 different ones or something like that?
Yeah, there's 6, about 95% of the population falls into 6 different categories. So there are 3 that are predominant in our church. And without getting into the details, they're traditionalists, modernists, and postmodernists. And so we just helped our staff understand how those 3 psychographic profiles understand the world and what their value systems are. Because if you know that they're present for pretty much every small group leader training you do, every service you hold, all that stuff, then they can start to form their communication in a way that's equally helpful, or at least as helpful as it can be to all 3 of those different psychographic profiles. We also are consistently talking about, the way we're having to constantly, you'll have to do this too. If you are serious about reaching people who are far from God and currently do not yet call Jesus their Lord and their Savior, then you need to constantly remind your staff that those people are present. They're here every Sunday. They're watching on YouTube. And
assume
therefore,
they're in the room, right?
Assume they're in the room. You can say anything about Christianity. You just have to give the context. You have to frame it for people so that they understand. You have to not use churchy jargon. And so that's just a constant, never-ending conversation that we have. And that helps you gain influence with people and to retain it. We also talk about politics, and we do talk about not to tell our staff how to vote or anything, but here's how a Republican might hear this, or a Democrat may hear this, or someone who's, ideologically confused might hear this. It just comes up on a really frequent basis as opposed to a big download, but you really have to be talking about that stuff if you want your team to really get it and understand.
Gotcha. So it's just woven through the fabric of everything you got always talking about in your normal communication channels. Okay. Love it. Love it. Okay. The second practice you talk about, this one, the first one was within your church and your staff. This one, in order to help us get better at not giving up influence unnecessarily, practice number 2 is to befriend people who are politically different from you. Okay.
Yes.
This sounds like, yes, I understand how that could help me, but that sounds so hard. Like, I know pastors are in bubbles, and sometimes, that's a generality, but sometimes they're in this bubble. They don't have a lot of friends who are different from them. How do you intentionally befriend people who are politically different from you without being weird?
So, I can't tell you how not to be weird. That very much depends on the person, I think. But I think there was about 80% of white evangelicals voted for the Republican candidate, and about 90% of Black Protestants voted for the Democratic candidate. And so part of it is like, if you know churches in your town, or white churches in your town, depending on where you're coming from, having some good, I think, relationships with other people of different ethnic backgrounds even will sometimes introduce you to different political ways of thinking things, because they just have a different story than you do. And so that can be very helpful. I think if you can find some people who think politically different than you, but share a common faith, right? Share Christianity, that's a great starting place. But then I'm so psychotic about this that I'll even, if I see a great article online from somebody where they're advocating for a political principle that I don't understand, or I'll sometimes just reach out to them via email or call them up because I want to make sure that I understand that if I'm talking to someone who thinks that way or someone who doesn't, I can represent that position in the strongest possible way. Caitlin Flanagan is a writer for The Atlantic, and a few months ago, she released a piece where she said one of the things that her father helped her understand and frustrated her with is that she would have a really strong opinion about something. And then he would say to her, and what is the strongest case for the alternative viewpoint? And if she couldn't make that, then he said, well, you don't really know for sure if you're holding to the right view or not. And so instead of straw manning arguments, I want to be able to steel man them, which means I have to talk to people who think differently than me about this stuff. So even a couple of weeks ago, I called somebody up who had written a seminary professor who'd written an article, and I just didn't quite understand where they were coming from. They were willing to have a conversation and talk. And now I know exactly where we diverge. I can tell you, oh, you see it this way and I see it this way right here. And that leads us to different landing places. But I could now make their case pretty strongly for them because I understand it. And I just think our culture, like kind of the value system we're handed in the West, is that once you pick a side, do everything you can to build up your case and strongman, steelman your argument. But we're not encouraged really to be curious about why other people might think differently. And I just want to encourage pastors to get more curious, man. Like we're losing in many cases because we're not curious enough. And we literally don't understand why someone would see it differently because we've never actually had a conversation with them.
So you're telling me instead of just meeting your buddies for breakfast and talking about how dumb that seminary professor was, you actually called that professor and had an intelligent conversation and got to where the point where you guys understood where each other were coming from. Not necessarily agreed,
right.
understood why you were coming from those different directions.
That's right. And after that, then I went and had breakfast and complained about it. But first, I talked to him about it. So
I love it. All right, cool. Last practice before we get to the Q&A. So the last practice that you mentioned in your chapter, this is to make your community indispensable. I'm sorry, I said the wrong word. Make your church indispensable to the community.
Yeah.
That is a practice, a helpful practice in not giving up influence unnecessarily. How are those two things related? Influence and making your church indispensable to the community.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to gain influence, basically. Like we've had a number of nonprofits in our area that churches have pulled funding for essentially politically stated reasons over the last several years. And when you can come in and be like, as a church, look, we don't have a political agenda here. We're not trying to force you into our understanding of, morality or our understanding of how things should go. But we see that you're trying to house people or feed people or whatever. Like, we just want to partner with you in that because we think you're doing good work. You just be amazed at the amount of goodwill that gives you. And also it's helpful because they've seen some examples of churches not doing that well. And so if you can come in and show them an example of a church doing that well, that's not just helpful for your specific church. That's helpful for the kingdom of God, like at a large scale level. And so we've just tried to be really intentional. One of the ways that we've done that too is just to talk to local government officials and local nonprofits and ask them, what do you need? Because a lot of times we assume that we know what they might need or how we might be able to be helpful. Yeah. And a lot of times what they tell us is way different than what we would have assumed. It's not always money. Sometimes it's hands and feet. Sometimes it's just support. Like, can we call sometimes and, talk to one of your counselors on staff about marriage concerns for our staff or whatever. There's all kinds of ways that we might be able to be helpful that might be outside of the box, but we don't know if we don't ask. And so, I just think the more that you can, make the community like a love and appreciate what it is that you're doing, the more influence you'll carry. And then they'll listen more when you have something to say about what's most important in life.
And probably give you a little more grace if they ever disagree with something that you are.
That's saying. That's right. And I'll just name that. Like, we haven't had this happen here, but anytime you have multiple staff, there's the chance that someone on your staff does have a moral failure at some point, right? Even if you can teach about it, you can talk about it, you can be praying with each other, but so at some point your church may make a mistake. Someone in your church may make a mistake. And then you try to handle that as transparently and as lovingly as possible. If people in your community know you to be a church of truth and grace, like they're honest about who they are, they've been helping us for so long, they're just more likely to give you grace if you have something like that happen than if they don't know anything about it. So they make all kinds of assumptions about who you are.
Okay, perfect, helpful. Josh, well, thank you for letting me get my questions in from the chapter in the book. But we've got some questions from everybody that's on here with us today. And so what do you say we just kind of roll through some of these? You cool? You cool with that?
Sounds good, man. Yeah. Lunch can
Okay,
wait. Let's do it.
good, good. So this first question comes from Kevin. And this is going back to some of the political things we were talking about. And he says, how do you speak into issues that are by nature political while staying transcendent when it comes to politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Larry Hurtado is a New Testament scholar who wrote about kind of like the five distinctives of the early church.
Mhm.
And the major five distinctives, he said, the reason that it started to gain traction in the first century was because it was so different from the culture around them. So one of those, for instance, was their distinctive around sexuality, and that typically, anyone who wasn't a man was essentially considered property. So women were property, children were property, slaves were property, and any of them kind of in Roman culture and society could be used to gratify men sexually. That was just kind of the predominant thinking of the day. The New Testament comes along in the early church with this very different sexual ethic that spoke to the dignity of every human being, because every human is created in the image of God, and it was just radically different. In addition, there was the sanctity of life. They were, a lot of times you'd have families who were leaving unwanted children exposed out in the elements, and the church became like, it gained a reputation for taking these children in and for giving them a home. So there's a sexual ethic. There was a care for life ethic, but there was also an ethic around racism. The church believed that Jesus was tearing down racial divides between Jew and Gentile, which was just a radical approach in the first century. And there was also an ethic around female dignity as well. Like women were not treated very well by society, and then you have the church elevating them into leadership in places. And then there was also around forgiveness, right? Forgiveness. There was a major streak in the church of forgiveness. We forgive those who wrong us, as opposed to this prideful attitude that if someone wrongs me, it's a major issue. So if you take those kind of like five issues, two of them seem like Republicans, two of them seem like Democrats, and forgiveness seems like neither side. Neither side is for forgiveness. Okay. So what I find is that it's refusing to take the categories that are handed to us, that if you're pro-life, you are therefore all in for the Republican Party, or if you're pro-racial reconciliation, you are therefore all in for the Democratic Party. And it's being able to say, like, these issues should matter to Christians because they mattered to Jesus, and we should live these out in such a way. But you may, depending on how you decide, right? Christians have never agreed on the best way for the state to govern, ever. Look back in our history. And so you may arrive at different political conclusions as to how you vote, but you shouldn't see the way you vote as you doing your kingdom of God duty in your society. You should be living this out day in and day out. And so what I would encourage people is to push your congregation to recognize that one of the challenges we have in the United States specifically right now is that politics has become our religion. And the way we think about Christianity for many people is shaped more by the political information that they take in throughout the week than it is about the actual gospel. And if the gospel is in conflict with their political party, many times they will choose the political party over the gospel. And so I just want to encourage pastors to let people know that you got to shine a spotlight on it, because no one else is doing it for them. And they're going to listen to 35 minutes, 40 minutes of a message for you every week. And then they may go home and listen to 4, 5, 6, 8 hours a day of Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or their favorite podcast host. And if we're not doing something to push back on that spiritual malformation, we can't really disciple them well in the way of Jesus.
Right. No, I hear you. Good. Thank you. Thank you for answering that question. Another question that someone's asking is what are some effective ways to engage in meaningful dialogue with church members who hold differing political views without causing division?
Yeah. It's like individual church members, like a one-on-one kind of conversation.
Yeah, not in preaching.
Yeah. The first thing I would recommend is you need to be able to really understand why someone would vote one way or the other. There's an endless amount of resources out there for you to kind of like get your mind around that. But if you ever sit down with someone and your starting assumption is, well, they're just an idiot, or they just don't, believe the Bible or whatever. Likely you just don't really understand their starting place in the conversation. So the best advice I can give you is to really try and understand where people are coming from. And then after that, you got to meet them where they are. And if you suspect after a conversation that they need more discipling in this area, remember that you don't need to go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in one conversation. Like incremental change is great. Like if someone's at, like alphabet, if they're at like letter B and you'd love to see them get to letter X, that's great. But we celebrate the movement from B to C, and we celebrate the movement from C to D. So anything you can do to help nudge them a little bit in a more Christ-like, a more biblical perspective than they currently have is a win. And it's when we try to get them all the way to where maybe we are or where we think they should be that they can get super defensive, and then we lose influence with them completely.
Gotcha. Okay. Here's a good question that someone put in. So a lot of times, especially when it comes to politics or other things, the battleground is on social media, right? So,
yes.
So how do you train your staff and volunteers to manage personal influence and church influence on social media? Or you just, I don't know, we just put our head in the sand and hope nothing bad happens.
Yeah, we have a social media policy in our staff handbook that talks about expectations around social media. So I think it needs to start by naming it as an important thing up front in the hiring process even. And then it's ongoing training about there's really no separation of what you say online and the fact that you're, a pastor or director or, an employee on this staff. Like you can even say, hey, this isn't the opinion of Verve City Church. I'm just saying, like, people just aren't able to bifurcate that out. There's just no way for them to do it. So we just encourage people not to get into political arguments online because, you guys probably remember, like, when was the last time you saw, someone's mind totally changed on Facebook or Instagram? Yeah, it's never happened. Like, it's just it's a waste of your time to try and like engage people there in that way, because you're having a public argument is what you're having. And so even if you call out someone for being totally wrong on like a piece of information they shared, you have now made them lose face in front of an audience. Other people are seeing them lose face. And so they're going to be highly defensive. And even if you win the argument, you can look like a jerk, or you can look like, you're lambasting someone publicly. Like, I just don't think it's a winning proposition. So we try to use social media to, we post stuff about our church. We post stuff about Jesus, post stuff about our families. We really encourage people not to enter the political domain there. I realize different churches could do that differently, but we've just not found it helpful to do otherwise.
Okay. Gotcha. Here's a good one. This one comes from James. And this one is the idea of how do you influence current narratives, like, for instance, gender identity issues and things like that might be misguiding young people to make life-changing decisions. How do you wade into that, help people without losing influence?
Yeah. Well, again, if you're going to say something that's in opposition to kind of like a dominant cultural narrative, there are some people who will tune you out, and there are some people you will lose influence with. So I can tell you what we're in the process of right now, and other churches have gone before us in doing this. But when it comes to issues like that, we're in the process of writing some white papers as to like what we believe on that and why. And those aren't for public publication, but it is something that our staff will have as a resource. And then we have to, create some policies after that. It's like what that means for our volunteer structure or anything else at the same. And so then we'll do a message series on this probably in a little over a year is what we're looking at, because this is a very long process for us. That'll include some resources for parents and some resources for students and some resources for those who are confused by this issue. I really do think you have to, if you're going to push back on a cultural narrative, you're going to have to provide some resources that help people. And you have to see it not as an issue to be addressed, but as people to be loved and cared for. I don't see any other way forward on that. Right. And so, that's kind of, I say take a holistic approach. There are some people who you may lose influence with then if you say something different than what they want you to say. But again, if you're trying to be as faithful to the scripture as you best understand it, that's always the right decision.
I love that lens, though, that target of caring for a person, not fighting for a.
That's right.
Yeah, I love that.
That's right.
Here's another good one. I guess this one is more like when it comes to preaching. So it's when tackling a scripture passage, this one comes from Jim. when tackling a scripture passage or a subject that might be divisive,
Mm.
how do you make sure your leadership team and staff are in agreement? Or you're like,
Yeah.
well, I can't, or I don't know.
Well, I mean, obviously you fire everyone who doesn't agree with you. It's very simple. So, no, so actually
Draw a line in the sand.
we're doing a series starting in a couple of weeks called Party Crasher, How Jesus Transcends Politics. Okay, so I know it's a series that people will have opinions about.
Right.
So one of the ways I'm doing it this time, I'm finishing up the outline of the series, and then I'm going to sit down next week. I've already got it on the calendar with some of my staff, and I'm going to talk through the outline, and I'm going to have them flag for me, hey, what could be more clear? What did I not say that I should have? What did I say that I shouldn't have? Right, those kinds of things. And then we'll also bring in our whole. So that'll be a subset. Then we'll bring in our whole staff each week as we go through the series, and I'll ask them to give me feedback as we go through this. So it does involve, like, on a topic like that, I want to make sure I have buy-in from my staff, and that they understand also why we're doing it, what we're hoping to accomplish with it, and what we hope people will do with it, going forward. Because if they're hearing it for the first time on a Sunday, they may have all kinds of questions that you could have helped them wrestle with beforehand, so that they can be helpful to you. Because we often say that every staff member has a bucket of gasoline and a bucket of water. Mm-hmm. And when a congregant has an issue, they'll either pour gasoline on the issue or they'll pour water on it. Right. And so if a congregant's like, man, I can't believe we talked about politics here, even if we're talking about Jesus transcending it, then they could be like, yeah, I was surprised too. Well, that's gasoline, right? You've just right? Or even if people are just like, man, I hate it when the pastor talks about politics, and they're just like, yeah, still gasoline, right? It can be a small thing. So we just want to make sure there's alignment going into that, and people understand our why behind it, so that if a congregant has a concern, they can actually meet the concern in a helpful way, as opposed to just agreeing or walking away or whatever. So
perfect. Love it. All right, Josh, we got time for one more question. All right. But before we get to that, everybody, I do want to give you guys a couple of announcements of things coming up to be on the lookout for. One, we've already alluded to this a little bit, but we do have a book release coming this summer. ICN is publishing a book called A Church Every Community Needs. There you go. And like I said at the beginning, this book is written by, I don't know, about 12 or so of the different lead pastors from different partner churches of Irresistible Church Network, and each one takes a different attribute of this idyllic church that every community needs. And just like we're talking about today, a church that never gives up influence unnecessarily. Lots of great chapters in the book. Be on the lookout this summer. Actually, if any of you guys are coming to Drive Conference, there's going to be an advanced reader copy like this one. There's going to be given out at Drive Conference. You'll be able to get a kind of a sneak peek of, I think, 5 of the chapters before they are fully released. So be on the lookout for this book this summer. And also, speaking of Drive, unfortunately, Drive Conference registration is closed. The deadline has come and gone. However, all the content for Drive is going to be available in the Irresistible Church app. So if you're not subscribed to that, go ahead and subscribe to that. That content will be available for purchase maybe a month after Drive, which will be sometime in June, probably. So just be on the lookout for that stuff. You'll have access to many of the sessions, some breakouts, maybe some of the keynotes, stuff like that, with lots of helpful content. Cool, Josh. Okay, so last question here. This one comes from Constantine, and this one it kind of lines up. I saved it for last because it kind of lines up for your kind of final charge in your chapter that you gave. So Constantine asks, so how can this main mission that you've talked about be clearly defined and kept at the forefront of everyone's efforts? And I kind of teed this one up to you because this is kind of what you talked about at the end of your chapter. So it fits nicely with Constantine's question.
Yeah, I think whether you're the lead pastor, you're on the lead team, or you're part of the staff or part of the leadership, maybe you're a lay leader. It really is kind of up to you to keep the main mission of the church in front of people. You have to carry that culture. You have to be the one to constantly put it in front of people and to remind them why it is that you do what you do. And I think sometimes we go way too long without bringing that to the congregation. So in our church, we talk about it in staff meetings. We talk about it on Sunday mornings. We have our mission statement printed on things, T-shirts and mugs and all kinds of stuff. And then when we get questions about why it is that we do what we do, or why we're making a change, or why we're pursuing a particular thing, it always comes back to, hey, our primary goal here is to help people find life by following Jesus. And so, no, we're not going to support that political candidate because, we think that would be a hindrance to that mission, or we're not going to keep running that fruitless program because we think that would be a hindrance to that mission. And it's just pointing people back to the reason that we exist, because people may think you exist for all kinds of reasons. You'll do all kinds of things, but you have to be laser focused on your one thing. And I hope that your one thing is helping connect people to Jesus Christ.
Love it. Love it. Thank you. Josh, thank you so much, first of all, for writing the chapter in the book. It's awesome.
My pleasure, man.
To read it. 2, thank you for spending a whole hour with us here today and answering questions and all that stuff. So thank you so much for being willing to influence and pour back into other churches and other church leaders. So thank you for jumping on here, man. I love having this conversation.
No, thanks for the invitation, man. Always enjoy talking to you, Louis, and I'm so grateful for everybody who takes a look at this. Praying for you guys, man. Like it is there's a lot of weight on trying to lead a church through some difficult times. But man, I'm so excited about what God has for us as we move forward.
Perfect. And thank you to everybody else who jumped on here today. We will keep you guys updated when our next webinar is coming up, and we look forward to seeing you guys then. Have a great rest of the week. Have a good one, guys. See you, Josh. Go watch some movies, my friend.
Will do, sir.
All right, bye.